We're going to starve this winter if you don't help us." My daughter sobbed into the phone, claiming they were eating rice and beans while water poured through their roof. She used my grandson's comfort as a weapon, pressing the barrel against my heart to extract my life savings. They thought retirement had softened the iron judge into a senile open wallet. They were about to learn that you don't present false evidence to a man who spent 40 years sending liars to prison. They wanted a payout. I was preparing a verdict. If this story finds you, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. It helps to know there are still people out there who believe in justice. It started with a phone call that changed everything. I spent 40 years perched high above the fray, sitting on a mahogany bench that felt less like a seat of judgment and more like a throne of isolation. I wore a black robe that smelled permanently of old paper, cedar shavings, and the stale anxiety of the accused. In my right hand, I held a gavel. It was a simple piece of turned hickory, scarred by decades of use. But when I brought it down, the sound was absolute. It sounded like thunder cracking inside a closed room. It was the period at the end of a sentence that could end a life. "My name is Thomas. In the Superior Court of Ohio," they whispered when I entered the room. They called me the Iron Judge. They said I had ice water in my veins, that I was a machine built of statutes and precedents, incapable of pity. They were wrong. I felt everything. I felt the trembling fear of the witness, the desperate hope of the plaintiff, the crushing weight of the guilty verdict. I simply learned, through painful necessity, how to hide it all behind a mask of stone. A judge cannot afford to bleed in public. In my courtroom, silence was a weapon more potent than any shout. I didn't yell, I didn't lecture, I just watched. I learned early on that human beings are fundamentally terrified of silence. They rush to fill it with words, and in doing so they unravel. They lie with their shifting eyes, scanning the room for an exit that isn't there. They lie with rehearsed tears that dry the instant the bailiff leads them away. But evidence, numbers, timestamps, those things never lie. They are the silent witnesses that scream the truth long after the voices have stopped. I retired 5 years ago, surrendering the robe and the gavel. It was the same year my wife Eleanor passed away. Since then, my world has shrunk from a bustling courthouse to the confines of the large Victorian house we bought in the 80s. It sits on a hill, a grand old thing of brick and ivy, now far too big for one man. The house is filled with echoes and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, suspended in the stagnant air. It groans in the wind, the settling floorboards sounding like footsteps that never arrive. I couldn't bear to leave. It held the sensory map of my life, the scent of Eleanor's vanilla extract ghosting through the kitchen, the phantom sound of my daughter's childhood laughter racing down the hallway, the spot on the rug where we drank wine on Christmas Eve. To leave this house would be to admit that they were truly gone. My daughter Sarah is 32 now. She was my heart, the one variable in my life that defied logic. She was the only person who could make the Iron Judge smile without trying. She was smart, beautiful, and deeply, almost recklessly, empathetic, or so I believed. She married a man named Mark 7 years ago. Mark was agreeable, a real estate agent who always seemed to be vibrating with the nervous energy of a man on the verge of a big deal, but the deal never closed. Mark drove a leased BMW he couldn't afford, the leather interior smelling of cheap cologne and desperation. He wore suits that were slightly too shiny, the fabric catching the light in a way that looked cheap. I didn't dislike him, precisely, but I watched him. Old habits die hard. I often saw a hunger in his eyes that made me uneasy. It wasn't the hunger of ambition, it was the hunger of entitlement, a desire for things he hadn't earned. Sarah loved him, though, and they had given me my grandson, Ethan. Ethan is 4 years old, a bundle of kinetic energy with Eleanor's piercing blue eyes. He is the reason I kept the big, drafty house. I wanted him to have a place to run, a place to build forts in the cavernous living room where the shadows stretched long. When he calls me Grandpa, the oppressive silence of the house evaporates. He is the only innocent thing left in my universe, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that I would burn the world to ash to protect him. It was a Tuesday night in November. The weather had turned, the sky bruising purple before unleashing a torrent. The rain lashed against the library windows, a rhythmic, aggressive drumming that usually helped me focus. I was sitting in my leather armchair, a heavy volume on naval history resting on my lap, trying to lose myself in the Battle of Trafalgar. But when the phone rang at 10:15 p.m., the sound cut through the peace like a serrated knife. It was too late for a social call. The digital clock on the mantel glowed with an ominous red accusation. I glanced at the caller ID, Sarah. A knot formed in my stomach, tight and cold. The Iron Judge instinct kicked in instantly. The adrenaline spike that comes when the jury foreman stands up. Something was wrong. Dad. Her voice was a whisper, trembling like a dead leaf in a storm. It was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual warmth. I sat up, the leather of the chair creaking beneath me. The book slid from my lap and hit the floor with a heavy thud. Sarah? I'm here. What is it? I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. Is Ethan okay? Ethan is fine. Physically, she stammered. Her breath hitched, ragged and uneven, as if she had been running for miles. But Dad, it's a disaster. What happened? My voice dropped an octave, entering the calm, controlled register I used for crisis management. We have to cancel Hawaii. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Hawaii. The trip had been the topic of every Sunday dinner for 6 months. It's supposed to be their 5th anniversary celebration, a 10-day getaway to Maui, a chance to rekindle a marriage that I suspected was fraying at the seams. Cancel it? I asked gently, trying to bridge the distance. Why, sweetheart? Is it work? No, she sobbed. The sound was raw, painful, a jagged tear in her composure. It's money, Dad. It always starts with money. In 40 years on the bench, 80% of the tragedies I witnessed began with the lack of it, or the greed for it. Mark's commission check, the big commercial sale, she continued, her voice gaining a frantic cadence. The agency is withholding it. They're auditing the deal. They won't release the funds for months. I see, I said. My mind was already calculating, shifting from father to adjudicator. Audits take time. Commission disputes are common. But to cancel a trip this close? And it gets worse, she said, her voice rising in panic, bordering on hysteria. The roof on our house, it started leaking tonight. The roof? I asked. It started leaking tonight. The roof? I asked. I pictured their suburban home, a cookie-cutter build from the early 2000s. Yeah, water is pouring into the master bedroom. It's coming down the walls, Dad. We had a contractor out an hour ago, an emergency service. She sniffled loudly, a wet, miserable sound. They said it's structural. A beam has rotted through. It's going to cost $15,000 to stabilize it. She paused. The silence on the line was heavy, pregnant with expectation. We can't afford the trip. We can barely afford the mortgage if we pay for this repair. My heart broke for her. I could hear the defeat in her voice, the shrinking of her spirit. I knew how much she needed a break. She sounded so small, like the little girl who used to scrape her knees on the driveway. Sarah, listen to me, I said, my voice softening, shedding the judicial armor. I can help. I have the savings. Let me cover the roof. You take the trip. No, she cried out. The refusal was sharp, instant, almost too quick. It wasn't the hesitation of pride. It was the reflex of fear. No, Dad. Mark has his pride. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He's devastated that he can't provide for us. He's in the bathroom right now, crying. If you bail us out for a luxury trip, it will destroy him. Sarah, family helps family. That is the statute of our lives. He says we have to be adults, she insisted, her voice tight. We're canceling everything. We're going to stay home. We'll eat rice and beans. We'll just try to survive the winter. Rice and beans? Mark was a man who ordered the ribeye and a second bottle of wine, even when I was paying. The image didn't fit the man. Financial final are nothing to be ashamed of, I said, testing the waters. I'm here if you need groceries, if you need anything for Ethan. Just pray for us, Dad, she whispered. I feel like such a failure. I feel like such a failure. I feel like such a failure. I have to go. Mark is. I need to go to him. The line went dead. I sat there in the silence of the library. The rain continued to hammer against the glass, but the room felt colder than before. I felt a profound, aching sadness. I was proud of her for standing by her husband, for choosing solidarity over comfort. That was the Eleanor in her, but I hated the thought of them suffering. I hated the thought of my grandson sitting in a cold, leaking house, buckets catching gray water, while I sat here in a museum of comfort with a fully funded retirement account and a pension that never stopped coming. I felt guilty for my own warmth, but beneath the guilt, in the dark corners of my mind where the judge still lived, something else was stirring. A tiny, nagging friction. Rice and beans. The immediate refusal of help. The sudden structural rot during a rainstorm. I decided to wait. I would give them space for a few days. Let the initial shame wash away. Then I would visit. I would bring a check for the roof, and I wouldn't take no for an answer. I went to bed that night, worrying about them, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl. I didn't know it then, but the defendant had just entered a plea, and it was a lie. A week passed, 7 days that felt less like the passage of time and more like the accumulation of dust. I respected their wish for privacy, though it went against every paternal pretension I possessed. The phone sat on the side table, a silent monolith. I found myself staring at it, willing it to ring, waiting for Sarah to tell me the roof was fixed, or that Mark had found a temporary gig, or just to hear Ethan's voice babbling about his latest Lego creation. But the phone remained dead. In the vacuum of that silence, my imagination became a cruel architect. I pictured them huddled together in the living room of that suburban drywall box, wearing coats indoors. I imagined buckets scattered across the floor, the relentless drip, drip, drip of water torture echoing through the night. I saw Ethan shivering under a thin blanket, his breath misting in the air, while Mark and Sarah argued in hushed, desperate tones over unpaid bills. The image of my grandson suffering kept me awake. I wandered the halls of my own Victorian fortress at 3 a.m., the floorboards groaning under my slippers. I checked my thermostat, 72 degrees. I opened my refrigerator full. The contrast was a physical weight. Guilt is a heavy coat to wear in a warm house. By Sunday afternoon, the passive waiting became intolerable. The iron judge did not sit on his hands while the world burned. He acted. I went to the kitchen and began to chop carrots, celery, onions. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the knife against the wooden block was grounding. I seared cubes of chuck roast until the kitchen smelled of browned butter and rosemary. Sarah's favorite comfort food. Beef stew. It was a primitive offering, a bowl of warmth counter the cold I imagined they were living in. I packed it into heavy Tupperware containers, stacking them like bricks. I stopped at the bakery on 4th Street and bought a box of the sugar cookies Ethan loved, the ones with the thick blue icing. I told myself I was just dropping off food, a porch drop. I wouldn't intrude, I wouldn't shame Mark. But deep down, beneath a layer of benevolent grandfather, the investigator was waking up. I needed to see the roof. I needed to assess the structural damage myself. I pulled up to their driveway at 2 p.m. The sky was a flat, oppressive sheet of slate gray, threatening snow, but delivering only a damp, biting wind. The neighborhood was one of those sprawling developments built in the early 2000s, winding streets with names like Oak Run and Cedar Bend, where there were neither oaks nor cedars. The houses were huddled close together, clad in beige vinyl. Their house was dark. That was the first thing that struck me. Not just unlit, but vacant. There is a specific quality to an occupied house, even when the lights are off, a sense of vibration, a hum of life. This house looked like it was holding its breath. Mark's leased silver BMW was gone. Sarah's practical SUV was gone. The driveway was empty, a slab of concrete stained with old oil spots. The lines were drawn tight on every window, presenting a unified front of rejection. They must be out, I reasoned, fighting the sudden spike of adrenaline, maybe at the hardware store buying supplies, maybe at the laundromat if the water damage hit the wiring. I stepped out of my car. The wind bit through my wool coat. I carried the bag of food, the warm weight of the stew pressing against my side. I walked up the concrete path to the porch. I looked up. I expected disaster. I expected the blue plastic tarp that signifies suburban tragedy. I expected missing shingles, the jagged teeth of a damaged roofline, or at least a dumpster in the yard, filled with sodden drywall. The roof looked pristine. The asphalt shingles lay flat and uniform, a dark, uninterrupted pattern. The flashing around the chimney was intact. There was no tarp, no ladder, no scaffolding. I set the food down on the porch swing and stepped back into the yard. Squinting against the gray light, I adjusted my glasses. I walked around to the side of the house, my dress shoes squishing into the wet dormant grass. I am not just a judge. Before law school, I studied engineering. I know how buildings fail. I know that a leak severe enough to cost $15,000 and flood a master bedroom leaves scars on the exterior. It warps the fascia. It stains the soffits. The gutters were clean, attached firmly to the eaves. I scanned the siding. No water stains. No rot. No swelling of the particle board beneath the vinyl. Strange. My mind began to perform the mental gymnastics of denial. Maybe the leak is internal. A pipe burst in the attic. A valley of flashing failure that isn't visible from the ground. But Sarah had been specific. The roof. She said the water was pouring in. She said a beam had rotted. You don't fix a rotted structural beam in 3 days without a crew, a permit, and a hell of a lot of noise. I stood there in the side yard, the cold seeping into my bones. The silence of the house felt aggressive now. It wasn't just quiet, it was hiding something. "Oh, hello, Judge." The voice startled me. I turned sharply, my hand instinctively going to a gavel that wasn't there. It was Mrs. Gable, the neighbor from 2 doors down. She was a woman of indeterminate age, wrapped in a neon pink puffer jacket, walking a standard poodle that looked as manicured as she did. Mrs. Gable was the neighborhood watch, the town crier and the surveillance state all rolled into one. In my court, she would have been a hostile witness. But on the street, she was a gold mine. "Mrs. Gable," I said, smoothing my coat and forcing a polite grandfatherly smile. "Good afternoon. Looking for the kids?" she asked, stopping at the edge of the property. The poodle sniffed at my tire. "Yes," I said. "I brought some food. Sarah told me they've had a tough week with the house repairs. I wanted to surprise them." Mrs. Gable's brow furrowed. She cocked her head to the side, the neon hood crinkling. "Repairs?" she asked. The word hung in the air. "What repairs?" "The roof," I clarified, pointing upward. "Sarah called me Tuesday night in a panic. Said they had a major leak during the storm. Structural damage." Mrs. Gable frowned, looking up at the house, then back at me. Her expression wasn't one of sympathy. It was one of genuine confusion. "That's odd," she said slowly. "I'm retired, you know. I'm home all day. I sit in my front window and read." She lowered her voice. "Judge, I haven't seen a single truck here all week. No contractors. No frantic running around. And we did have that rain on Tuesday, but I didn't see them putting out buckets or dragging wet carpet to the curb." My smile faltered. It felt stiff on my face, a mask that was slipping. "Really?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lower register. "In fact," she continued, warming to the subject of gossip, "I haven't seen them since Wednesday morning. I assume they went away on vacation." A cold prickle of unease started at the base of my neck and crawled upward. It was the sensation I used to get when a defendant's alibi started to disintegrate under cross-examination. "Went away?" "Yes," she nodded vigorously. "I saw a taxi pick them up, early. Must have been 5:00 a.m. on Wednesday. It was pitch black, but the headlights woke me up. A taxi, a big van taxi, airport shuttle type." She paused, searching her memory. "They had luggage, Judge? Big suitcases. The hard-shell kind. And Ethan had his little backpack." She smiled, oblivious to the world collapsing behind my eyes. "They looked like they were going somewhere fun. Mark was wearing shorts. In November. Can you believe it? Shorts, luggage, Wednesday morning." The timeline snapped into place with the brutal precision of a steel trap. Tuesday night, the panic call. The sobbing, the financial ruin. Wednesday morning, the taxi. "I see," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. It was flat, neutral, monotone. It was the judge's voice. I had to protect the family name, even as the family was rotting from the inside. They must have gone to stay with Mark's parents while the work is being done inside. I lied. The fabrication tasted like ash in my mouth. That must be it. The fumes, you know. Oh, of course. Mrs. Gable beamed, satisfied with the logic. That makes sense. Well, tell them I said hello when you see them. I will. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. She walked away, the poodle trotting beside her. I stood alone in the driveway. I looked back at the house. It was no longer a tragedy. It was a stage set. A prop used to extract money. I walked back to the porch and picked up the stew. I wasn't going to leave it. They didn't deserve it. I got back into my car. The smell of the rosemary beef filled the cabin, rich and savory. 10 minutes ago, it smelled like love. Now, it smelled like nausea. I put the car in reverse and backed out slowly. I drove with mechanical precision, obeying every stop sign, using every turn signal. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was screaming. Rice and beans, the roof, Mark crying in the bathroom. It wasn't just a lie. It was a production. They had scripted a scene, rehearsed the dialogue, and performed it for an audience of one, the gullible, lonely old man with the checkbook. I drove home, the gray sky pressing down on the windshield. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and in the fertile soil of my betrayal it was already growing roots. In my experience, when stories don't align, there is a reason, and it is usually a dark one. The Iron Judge was no longer retired. The court was now in session. That evening, the house felt larger than it ever had before. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. I sat in the library, the only light coming from the green banker's lamp on my desk, and the cold, harsh glow of my laptop screen. I am not a man of the digital age. I prefer paper, the tactile grain of a legal brief, the smell of ink. But the court had transitioned to digital records a decade before I retired, and I had learned to navigate databases with the same grim efficiency I applied to case law. I logged into Facebook. Eleanor had set up the account for me 3 years ago. It's how people share photos of their children. Tom, she had said, guiding my clumsy fingers over the trackpad. If you want to see Ethan grow up, you have to be where the pictures are. I rarely used. To me, it was a chaotic stream of consciousness. Political rants from retired bailiffs, pictures of casseroles, and vague, attention-seeking complaints about the weather. But tonight, it was a surveillance tool. I typed in Sarah's name. Blocked, or perhaps just private. I couldn't see her wall. I tried Mark. Nothing. They were smart enough to curate their audience, keeping the ATM in the dark. But criminals, no matter how careful, always forget the peripheral witnesses. I typed in Linda Harrison, Mark's mother, my in-law. Linda and Gary were people I tolerated for Sarah's sake. They were loud, flashy, and perpetually dissatisfied with their station in life. Gary was a retired mechanic with a gambling itch and a taste for sports cars he couldn't maintain. Linda judged the worth of a human soul by the brand of their handbag. They were the kind of people who confused debt with wealth. I hit enter. Linda's profile was wide open, a public ledger of vanity. I scrolled past reposted memes and blurry photos of restaurant desserts. And then the algorithm delivered the evidence. The post was time-stamped. Yesterday at 2:00 p.m. The caption read, in bold, cheerful font, Aloho from paradise. Nothing beats a surprise family getaway. So grateful for this trip of a lifetime. Blessed grandparents' duty, Maui magic. I stared at the screen. My glasses slipped down the bridge of my nose. I pushed them back up with a trembling finger. It was a photo, high definition, vibrant. It showed a white sandy beach, the ocean behind it a piercing, impossible turquoise. The sun was blindingly bright, a sharp contrast to the gray rain sliding down my library window. In the foreground stood Linda and Gary. They were holding cocktails adorned with little paper umbrellas. They wore matching floral leaves. They looked tanned, happy, and unmistakably expensive. But it was the background that stopped my heart. It was the background that turned the unease in my gut into a shard of ice. building a sandcastle near the surf. His small back to the camera was a boy in blue swim trunks. My grandson, Ethan, and sitting in low beach chairs next to him, laughing with their heads thrown back, holding hands, were Sarah and Mark. I felt a cold sensation wash over me, starting at my scalp and moving slowly, methodically, down to my toes. It was a physical numbness. The room seemed to tilt. It wasn't anger. Not yet. Anger is hot. This was shock, the absolute zero of emotional impact. It was the sensation of watching a bridge collapse while you were standing on it. I zoomed in on the image, the pixels blurred then sharpened. Sarah looked healthy. She didn't look like a woman crushed by financial ruin. She didn't look like a woman eating rice and beans in a freezing house. She was wearing a designer swimsuit, a piece I knew cost upwards of $300. She looked radiant. Mark was smoking a cigar. He looked like a king, surveying his dominion. He looked like he had conquered the world. I checked the location tag, the Grand Wela, Maui. I knew that resort. Eleanor and I had stayed there for our 25th anniversary. It was a palace of fountains and tropical gardens. It cost a fortune. $1,000 a night for a standard room, $2,000 for the suites they would need for a party of 5. Financial problems, I whispered to the empty room. My voice cracked. Roof leak. My mind began to race, connecting the dots with judicial precision. Why lie? If they wanted to go on vacation with his parents, that was their prerogative. I wasn't a jealous man. I wasn't a tyrant. But to call me crying, to invent a disaster, to construct a narrative of poverty so extreme that I would lose sleep worrying about my grandson's warmth? Unless they didn't pay for it. Linda and Gary were chronically broke. They had filed for bankruptcy twice in the 90s. Sarah and Mark claimed they were destitute, victims of a withheld commission. So who paid? The judge in me woke up fully now. The grieving father was shoved into a corner of my heart, told to sit down and be quiet. The judge was suspicious. The judge smelled a crime. I closed the laptop. The sudden darkness of the screen left a ghost image of the beach burned into my retinas. I sat in the dark for a long time. I began to formulate a plan. The next morning, I drove to the bank. The rain had stopped, but the streets were slick and black. I parked my modest sedan between 2 luxury SUVs and walked into the branch. I bypassed the tellers. I went straight to the glass-walled office at the back. The nameplate on the door read Robert Henderson, branch manager. I had known Robert for 20 years. We played golf occasionally. He was a good man, discreet and meticulous. "Thomas," he said, standing up immediately as I entered. He looked surprised. I rarely came in person. "Good to see you. Checking the portfolio?" "I need to check the logs, Robert," I said. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a handshake. I sat down in the chair opposite him. I had to review the trust fund I set up for Ethan, and my joint checking account with Sarah. I had added her to the checking account 5 years ago after her mother died. For emergencies, I had said. So you never have to worry if something happens to me. Rupert sensed the gravity in my tone. He sat down and began to type. Clack, clack, clack. His brow furrowed. He stopped typing. He adjusted his monitor. "That's odd," he muttered. "What is it?" "The trust fund," he said slowly, looking at me over his spectacles. "Access was requested last week. By you." My hands tightened on the armrests of the chair. "I didn't request access," I said. "Well, someone with your password did. They tried to initiate a withdrawal. $10,000. From a 4-year-old's education fund." "Yes." "It was denied because the trust requires a physical signature for any amount over $5,000. But the attempt was made." I let out a breath, a sharp hiss of air. They had tried to rob Ethan first. They tried to cannibalize their own son's future to pay for cocktails and ocean views. "And the checking account?" I asked, my voice hardening. Robert hesitated. He looked pale. He turned the screen toward me. "I think you need to see this, Thomas." I leaned forward. The ledger on the screen was a hemorrhage of red ink. 1122. Withdrawal. $3,000. Cash. 1123. Transfer. Mark Harrison, Real Estate, $5,000. 1124. Delta Airlines, $4,800. 1124 Grand Well Air Resort. Deposit $4,500. 1125 Maui Excursions. I read the lines twice. They hadn't just lied to me. They hadn't just ignored me. They had stolen from me. They used my money. Money I saved over 40 years of public service to pay for the vacation they said they couldn't afford. They took my money to fly Mark's parents to Hawaii in first class. They were treating me like a wallet, a senile open wallet. They took nearly $20,000 in a week, I said. Thomas. Robert whispered. He looked sick. Do you want to file a fraud report? This is theft. Unauthorized use of a joint account for... Well, this is clearly misappropriation. If I file a report, I said, thinking aloud, the police will be waiting at the gate when they land. Sarah will be arrested in front of Ethan. I closed my eyes. I saw Ethan building his sandcastle. I saw the trauma of handcuffs, the flashing lights, the foster care system. No, I rasped. Not yet. Are you sure? Freeze the account. Market restricted. In person only. But do not call the police. Thomas, they cleaned you out of liquid cash. I want to handle this within the family first, I said, standing up. I want to see if they have a conscience left. I left the bank, but I didn't go home. I needed information that a bank ledger couldn't provide. I needed to know why. Greed is a powerful motivator, but desperation is stronger. This level of recklessness, trying to drain a trust fund, emptying a checking account, smelled of desperation. I drove to the industrial side of town near the rail yards. The air here smelled of diesel and rust. I parked in front of a pawn shop and walked up the narrow staircase to the office above. Frank Russo, Investigations. Frank was a retired homicide detective. He used to testify in my court. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had the scars to prove it. He was cynical, chain-smoked, despite his doctor's orders, and was the best investigator in the state. Judge, Frank nodded as I walked in. The office was a cloud of blue smoke. He looked tired, his face lined like a road map of bad decisions. What brings the law to the gutter? I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I slid the photo of Mark printed from Facebook across the scratched metal desk. I need eyes, Frank. Frank picked up the photo. He studied Mark's shiny suit, his eager smile. Find out everything, I said. Mark's business, their debts, the in-laws, Linda and Gary Harrison. I want to know who they owe, how much, and since when. Trouble? Frank asked, looking up. Big trouble, I said. They are spending money they don't have, and they are stealing it from me. Frank stubbed out his cigarette. He opened a fresh notebook. Give me 3 days, Frank said. I'll dig until I hit the coffin. I walked out into the gray afternoon. The investigation had begun. I was no longer just a father or a grandfather. I was the prosecutor, gathering the evidence for the trial of my life. 3 days later, 72 hours of waiting that felt like serving a sentence in solitary confinement. I agreed to meet Frank at a diner called Sal's on the southern edge of the city. It was a chrome and neon relic from the 50s that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and frying onions. It was the kind of place where the vinyl booths were patched with duct tape and the patrons kept their heads down. It was neutral ground. I arrived 15 minutes early. I sat in a booth near the back, facing the door. An old habit. Outside, the weather had settled into a grim, relentless drizzle that blurred the streetlights into streaks of dirty yellow. I watched the rain slide down the glass, distorting the world outside. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. The lines around my mouth were deeper, etched by gravity, in the new, heavy weight of suspicion. I ordered a black coffee. It arrived in a thick ceramic mug, steaming and bitter. I wrapped my hands around it, seeking warmth, but my fingers remained cold. Frank Russo walked in at 8:05 p.m. He brought a gust of wet, cold air with him. He shook off his trench coat, scattering droplets onto the linoleum floor. He looked heavier than he had 3 days ago, burdened by what he was carrying. He slid into the booth opposite me. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He simply placed a thick manila folder on the table between us. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. It's ugly, Thomas, Frank said. His voice was gravel, roughened by smoke and bad news. He signaled the waitress for coffee, but his eyes never left mine. I've seen some bad business in 40 years. Domestic disputes, hidden families, embezzlement. But this, he trailed off, shaking his head. Tell me, I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Frank opened the file. The papers were crisp, white, and damning. First, Frank said, pointing to a photocopy of a state license. Mark's career. He's been struggling, I said, reciting the lie I'd been fed. The market is tough. The market is fine, Frank corrected bluntly. Mark isn't. He hasn't been a licensed real estate agent for 6 months. I stared at the document, stamped across it in bold red letters. Revoked. Revoked? Revoked? Caught pocketing escrow money, Frank explained, tapping the paper with a nicotine-stained finger. He was floating deposit checks to pay personal debts. The agency found out. They fired him quietly to avoid a scandal. But they pulled his license. He's been unemployed since May. But he leaves the house every morning, I whispered. He puts on a suit. He goes to the track, Thomas, or the casino down on the river. Frank flipped the page. A spreadsheet appeared. It was a chaotic list of numbers, dates, and names that sounded like aliases. He's a gambler, Frank said. And not a good one. He chases losses. He plays high-stakes poker with people who don't accept IOUs. The financial problems are real, Frank finished. But not because of a withheld commission. They are real because he owes nearly $200,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. 200,000 to a loan shark named Leo Varga. The name hit me like a physical blow. I knew Leo Varga. He had appeared in my courtroom twice, in the 90s, usually insulated by 3 layers of high-priced defense attorneys. Varga ran a private lending business that operated out of a strip club. He didn't sue for non-payment. He broke things. Bones. Kneecaps. Spirits. He borrowed money from Varga to pay for the trip, I asked, incredulous. No, he borrowed from Varga to pay off other debts. He stole from you to pay for the trip. The trip is a distraction, a way to keep Sarah happy, to keep the parents happy, to keep up appearances while the walls close in. I sat back, the leather of the booth squeaking. I felt sick. My daughter was married to a man who had entangled their lives with organized crime. She was sleeping next to a ticking bomb. Is Sarah involved? I asked, dreading the answer. Does she know? Frank hesitated. He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing. She knows about the debts. I found texts. She's panicked. She's terrified. Varga is going to come to the house. So she stole from me to survive. I rationalized.
She's desperate. Fear makes people do terrible things.
Thomas, Frank said softly. There's more. He reached into the bottom of the folder. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were handling a loaded weapon. I went through their trash. It's dirty work, but it pays. He pulled out a crumpled, coffee-stained document. It had been torn in half and taped back together. I found this in the recycling bin, in their garage. He slid it across the table. I looked at the header. The legal jargon was as familiar to me as my own name. In the probate court of Hamilton County, in the matter of Thomas J. Sterling, petition for appointment of guardian for an incompetent adult. The world stopped. The noise of the diner, the clatter of silverware, the sizzling of the grill, the low hum of conversation vanished. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. What is this? My hand shook so violently I couldn't touch the paper. They drew it up last month, Frank said, his voice low and compassionate. It's a draft, but they have a final version ready to file. Guardianship? I choked out. They want to take control of me. Read the cause, Frank said. I looked down. Under reason for guardianship it read. The proposed ward suffers from advanced cognitive decline, dementia, and paranoia. He is no longer capable of managing his financial or personal affairs. He poses a risk to himself. Dementia? I hissed. I am sharp as a tack. I read 3 books a week. I manage my own portfolio. They have a doctor, Frank said. Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne, I spat the name. The pill mill doctor. I signed a warrant for his clinic once. He's still practicing somehow. For $5,000 paid from your checking account, by the way. He signed a medical affidavit declaring you mentally unfit. He claims he examined you. He's never met me. It doesn't matter, Frank said. If they file this, and you don't contest it immediately, they get temporary emergency guardianship. They get the keys to the kingdom, Thomas. Why? I asked. The word was a plea. Why would she do this? She's my daughter. She was my heart. Because of the house, Frank said. And the retirement fund. He laid out the strategy, cold and clinical. Once they have guardianship, they plan to place you in a facility. A cheap one. Sunrise Meadows on the east side. I knew Sunrise Meadows. It was a warehouse for the forgotten. A place that smelled of urine and despair. They will liquidate the Victorian house, Frank continued. It's worth, what, $800,000. They sell the house. They drain your savings. And they pay off. Virgo. Mark gets to keep his kneecaps. They get to keep their lifestyle. And you, rot, I whispered. I rot in a room with no windows while they spend my life's work. The cruelty was breathtaking. It wasn't just theft. It was an erasure. My daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders, the woman I had comforted when her mother died, was planning to bury me alive. She was going to strip me of my dignity, my home and my freedom, just to feed the insatiable hunger of her husband's addiction. I looked at the rain lashing against the window. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. They aren't just canceling a trip, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. They are canceling me. What do you want to do? Frank asked. He leaned forward. We have enough here for conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse. We can go to the cops tonight. They can be in cuffs by morning. I imagined the police cars, the sirens, the neighbors watching, screaming as his parents were dragged away, but then I imagined myself in Sunrise Meadows. I imagined losing my mind for real, trapped in a plastic chair, wondering why my daughter never visited. The sadness in my chest began to harden. It cooled, crystallizing into something sharp and heavy. The iron judge was standing up. No, I said. I wiped my face with a napkin. I straightened my tie. No police. Not yet, Thomas. They are dangerous. Desperate people are dangerous. I know, I said, but I want to look her in the eye. You want a confession? I want a hearing, I said. The tone of my voice made Frank sit back. It was the voice that had sentenced murderers to life without parole. I want to see if she will do it to my face. I want to give her one last chance to be my daughter before she becomes the defendant. You're going to set a trap, Frank realized. I'm going to invite them to dinner, I said, and I'm going to serve them the truth. You're playing with fire, Judge. I am the fire, I said. I just need you to be ready. I stood up and threw a $50 bill on the table. Get everything ready, Frank. The records, the photos, the affidavit. Make copies, certified copies. I walked out into the rain. The cold didn't bother me anymore. I was already frozen inside. They returned 10 days later. The silence of the house was broken by the sound of tires on gravel, a sound I had once welcomed, but now it sounded like an invading army. I had spent the week preparing not just the evidence, but the stage. I cleaned the house until it smelled of lemon oil and discipline. I set the dining room table with Eleanor's good china, the gold-rimmed plates we saved for Thanksgiving. I wanted the setting to be perfect. A tableau of family tradition to contrast with the ugliness they were bringing through the door. I played the role. I called Sarah on Thursday, my voice deliberately thin, wavering just enough to suggest frailty. I missed you, I had said. Come for dinner. I made a roast. We'd love to. Dad, she chirped. Her voice was bright, artificial. It lacked the fatigue of a woman living in a disaster zone. There was no guilt in it. That was the hardest part to swallow, the absence of hesitation. Friday night, 6:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, checking my reflection in the hallway mirror. The iron judge was there behind the eyes, but the face was that of a lonely old man. I opened the door. They walked in, bringing a gust of cold November air mixed with something incongruous, the scent of coconut butter and humidity. Dad, Sarah hugged me. Her embrace was tight, Performative, she was glowing. Her skin was a deep golden bronze, the kind that only comes from 10 days under a tropical sun. Her hair was lighter, bleached by salt and UV rays. She looked healthy, rested, and vibrant. "You look well," I said, pulling back to look at her. I touched her cheek. "Very healthy." "Oh, she laughed nervously, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. "Stress makes me flush, and I've been trying to get outside more, even in the cold." Mark followed her in. He was wearing a beige sweater that did nothing to hide the stark tan line on his neck. He walked with a swagger I hadn't seen in years. "Thomas," he said, gripping my hand. His palm was calloused, not from work, but from golf clubs. "Good to see you. Did you fix the roof?" I asked immediately, keeping hold of his hand a second too long. I felt his pulse jump under my thumb. "Oh yes," Mark lied instantly. He didn't even blink. "Climbed up there myself. It was a nightmare, Thomas. Rotted flashing, torn shingles, but I patched it up, saved a bundle doing it myself." I looked at his hands. They were manicured, soft. There were no scrapes, no bruised knuckles, no sign of the brutal labor required to repair a structural leak. "Good man," I said, releasing his hand. "It's good to be self-reliant." We sat for dinner. The roast chicken sat in the center of the table, steaming. I poured wine, a cheap Merlot, not the vintage bottles I used to open. I watched them drink it without complaint. "Where is Ethan?" I asked, unfolding my napkin. "I set a place for him. He's with Linda and Gary," Sarah said quickly, cutting into her chicken. "They missed him so much. We haven't seen them in a while. "How are they?" I asked. "Linda and Gary? Good," Mark said through a mouthful of food. "Gary's back is bad. Sciatica. He's just resting." "Right," I said, taking a sip of water. "Hard to travel with a bad back. I suppose he hasn't flown lately." Sarah choked on her wine. It was a small, sharp sound. She coughed, patting her chest, her eyes darting to Mark. No flights," she wheezed. "Just resting at home. Why would he fly?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "Retirement makes people do strange things." The air in the room grew thin. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. I could see Mark's leg bouncing under the table, vibrating the floorboards. They were waiting for me to write a check. They were waiting for the doting grandfather to ask if they needed help with the bills. I reached into my pocket. "That's funny," I said. "I found something today." I pulled out a small, rectangular sticker. It was bright yellow and white, with a barcode and a 3-letter airport code printed in bold black ink. I placed it gently on the tablecloth, right between the salt and pepper shakers. "This fell out of your purse in the hallway, Sarah." They both froze. It was the reaction of prey spotting a predator. Mark stopped chewing. Sarah's hand hovered over her wine glass. They stared at the tag. "This tag says OGG, I said, tapping it with my index finger. "That's the EALE code for Kusuli Airport." I looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes. "That is on Maui." The room went absolutely silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Tick-yack, tick, tack, cock. Mark's face went red, the flush spreading up from his neck to his hairline. Sarah's eyes widened, her pupils dilating in panic. "Oh," she stammered, her voice high and breathless. That's old. That must be from years ago. From our honeymoon. It looks new," I said calmly. "The adhesive is still sticky, and if you look closely—" I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper. "The date stamp says Nov 2024. Mark slammed his fork down. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. "Why are you digging through her purse?" he demanded. His voice was loud, aggressive, designed to intimidate. "Invasion of privacy, Thomas. Is this what you do all day? Spy on your children?" "It fell off in the hall," I lied smoothly. "I merely picked it up. It's a mistake," Serby said, standing up so abruptly her chair screeched against the hardwood. She was trembling. Maybe it was on a bag. I bought at a thrift store. I don't know." "A thrift store bag with a tag from last week?" I asked. "Stop it." Mark stood up too, looming over the table. "You're confused, Thomas. You're mixing things up. You've been acting strange lately." Here it was. The gaslighting. The foundation for the guardianship. Strange, I asked. Because I can read a date? Because you're paranoid, Mark shouted. Accusing us of lying? After everything we do for you, we check on you, we bring you food. You bring me nothing, I said. You take. We have to go, Sarah said, grabbing Mark's arm. She looked terrified. Not of me, but of the truth coming out. He's having an episode, Mark. Look at his eyes. He doesn't know what he's saying. Tired from staying home? I asked, remaining seated. Was the roof repair exhausting? Yes, she snapped, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. Stress is exhausting, Dad. You wouldn't know, sitting here in your mansion. They stormed out. The front door slammed, shaking the house. I sat alone at the table. The roast chicken was cold. They knew I was suspicious. But they made a fatal error. They thought I was merely a suspicious, angry old man. They didn't know I had the bank records. They didn't know I had the photos. They thought they could spin this as my dementia. I let them go. I needed them desperate. I needed them to think that I was losing my grip, so they would make their final move. I waited 2 days. I called Robert at the bank the next morning and gave the order. Total freeze. On Sunday morning, the trap snapped shut. I was in the kitchen, brewing tea, when the pounding started. It wasn't a knock, it was a desperate hammering on the front door. Dad! Dad! Open up! It was Sarah. I took a slow sip of tea. I counted to 10. Then I walked to the door. I opened it. Sarah stood there, alone. Her hair was messy, her eyes wild. She was wearing a coat over pajamas. The bank, she cried, pushing past me into the hallway. My card was declined. I was at the grocery store, Dad, with a cart full of food. It was declined. She spun around, grabbing my lapels. The account is frozen. Did you do that? I looked at her. I softened my expression. I let my mouth hang slightly open, my eyes losing their focus. I acted confused. I rubbed my forehead with a trembling hand. Frozen? I murmured. That is strange. Did you call the bank? She demanded. I don't recall, I said. I might have forgotten to update something. The password, tout. I lost the paper with the password. You lost it? I've been so forgetful lately, Sarah, I whispered, looking down at my slippers. I tried to log in. Maybe I locked it by mistake. The days, they blur together. She paused. She looked at me. I could see the gears turning in her mind. She saw the forgetfulness. She saw the confusion. She didn't see a father in distress. She saw an opportunity. The guardianship plan was back on. I was handing her the evidence she needed for Dr. Thorne. Her posture changed. The panic vanished, replaced by a predatory calm. You're forgetting things, she asked softly, her voice dropping to that sickly sweet tone she used when she wanted something. Yes, I lied. I feel lost. She exhaled. Oh, Dad. It's okay. We can fix this. She took my hands. Her palms were sweating. We can help you manage things. Mark and I. We can take the burden off you. I would like that, I said. I just want everyone to be safe. But first, she said, sensing the opening, we have an emergency. A real one. What is it? She squeezed my hands. Marco's bad men, Dad. The people we borrowed from for the bills. Leo Varga, I asked. She froze for a split second, then nodded. She didn't ask how I knew the name. She was too focused on the money. Yes, he wants money. Today, or he will hurt us. Her eyes filled with tears, real tears this time, born of terror. He threatened to hurt Ethan, Dad. He said he knows where his preschool is. She was using my grandson as a shield. Again, she was willing to traumatize her father with threats against a child, just to cover her theft. How much? I asked. $100,000, she whispered. To clear everything. Then we are safe. Then we can take care of you. I have the money, I said slowly, in the investment account. Her eyes lit up. Can you transfer it? No, I said. I can't do it alone. I get confused by the screens. I walked to the library door and leaned against the frame. Call him, I said. Call Mark. I will. And call his parents. Linda and Gary, Why? She frowned. I want to settle this, I said, my voice firming up just enough to sound authoritative, but still desperate. I want to give you the money, all of it, to secure your future. Before I get worse, you want to give us all of it? I don't need it, I said, sweeping my hand around the room. I just need to be looked after. But I want everyone here. I want to look Eddie in the eye and make sure he understands. This is for Ethan. Really? She gasped. A smile broke across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated greed. She thought she had won. She thought the senile old man was surrendering his fortune. Yes, everyone must be here. Tonight, 7:00 p.m. I'll call them, she said, pulling out her phone. I'll tell them to come right away. She looked at me, and for a moment I saw the daughter I used to know. But then she looked at her phone, calculating the payout, and that girl vanished. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. You're saving us. I am, I said quietly, as she walked out the door to make the call. I am saving this family. I watched her drive away. I went to my desk. I picked up the phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. Detective Vance, I said, when the line connected. This is Judge Sterling. I need you to come to the house tonight and bring the district attorney. I have a confession to record. I set the stage with the meticulous care of a bailiff preparing for a capital murder trial. The dining room was no longer a place for family meals. It was a tribunal. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. I had shaved closely, the scent of sandalwood soap clinging to my skin. I wore my best charcoal suit, the one I had worn to my retirement ceremony. I tied my tie with a Windsor knot, tight and precise. I didn't wear the robe, but I felt its phantom weight on my shoulders. In the center of the table, sitting on the lace runner Eleanor had crocheted, lay a single thick manila envelope. It was sealed. At 6:45 p.m., I unlocked the back door. Detective Marcus Vance stepped into the mudroom, shaking rain from his hat. He was an older man now, thick around the middle, but his eyes were still sharp. 2 uniformed officers stood silently behind him. It's time, Marcus, I said softly. Wait in the kitchen. Listen for the cue. And the cue is? I have the solution here, I said. He nodded solemnly. We're ready, Judge. I'm sorry it came to this. So am I whispered. At 7:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. It sounded jarring, an intrusion. I opened the door to find the vultures waiting. Mark led the way, vibrating with a nervous energy that he tried to pass off as concern. Sarah was behind him, pale but determined, her eyes scanning the room for signs of the money. Behind them, shuffling in with theatrical slowness, were Linda and Gary. Thomas, Gary groaned, clutching his lower back with one hand and leaning on a cane with the other. Sorry about the delay. The back is acting up. Terrible spasms. He winced, a performance that would have been laughed out of a small claims court. Come in, I said. Sit down. My voice was low, commanding. It made them pause. For a second, the confused old man mask slipped, and they saw the Iron Judge, but their greed blinded them to the danger. They took their seats. Mark and Sarah on one side, Linda and Gary on the other. I remained standing at the head of the table. You said you had the money? Mark asked immediately. He didn't even take off his coat. He was sweating, his eyes darting to the envelope on the table. I said I have a solution, I corrected. We need the cash, Dad, Sarah said, leaning forward. Leo Varga called again. He gave us a deadline. Midnight, desperately, Mark added. For safety. And you have a plan for me?
Asked, looking at each of them in turn.
If I give you this money, what happens to me? Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Mark. We found a place, Dad. A lovely community. Assisted living. Safe, Mark emphasized. 24-hour care. So you can sell the house. I asked, gesturing to the high ceilings, the crown molding I had installed myself. To pay for your care, Mark said quickly, his eyes hungry. This place is expensive to maintain. We're doing it for you. I see, I said. You've thought of everything. We just want you to be happy, Linda chimed in, smiling. Her teeth were very white, her tan very deep. You deserve to rest, Thomas. Rest, I repeated. Yes, I am tired. I placed my hand on the manila envelope. The sound of my palm hitting the paper was the only noise in the room. I have the solution here, I said. They leaned in, 4 pairs of eyes fixed on the packet. They thought it was a cashier's check. They thought it was the deed to the house. But first, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried like a scream. A final question. One last chance for the record. I locked eyes with Sarah. I looked deep into the blue irises that mirrored my own. Did you go to Hawaii, Sarah? She didn't flinch. She looked right at me, her face a mask of tragic sincerity. No, Dad, she cried. How can you ask that? We stayed home. We suffered. We were terrified. And the missing money from the account? Hackers, Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Identity theft. We told you. And the guardianship papers? The room went dead silent. The air left the room. Sarah's face went the color of ash. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. What? Mark whispered. The papers you paid Dr. Eris Thorne $5,000 to sign, I clarified, my voice rising, filling the room with the authority of the bench, declaring me incompetent, declaring me a vegetable, so you could liquidate my life. Mark stood up, his chair tipping over backward. You're crazy, old man, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. See? This is the dementia talking. You're paranoid. Am I? I picked up the envelope. I didn't open it gently. I tore the top off. You came here to rob a weak old man, I said. You came to imprison your father in a warehouse so you could gamble away his legacy. I walked over to Sarah. She shrank back in her chair. Take this instead. I dropped the contents of the envelope onto the table. It wasn't a check. The photographs fanned out across the lace runner. Exhibit A. The high-resolution photo of them on the beach at the Grand Willet. Exhibit B. The bank transfer records showing the payments to the resort, the airlines, and the liquor stores. Exhibit C. Mark's revoked real estate license. Exhibit D. The text messages Frank had recovered, discussing how long it would take to put the old man away. And finally, sitting on top of the pile, the petition for guardianship, stamped across the front in red ink. Fraud. Sarah stared at the photos. She looked at the image of herself laughing in the sun, holding a cocktail, while her father sat in the rain worrying about her survival. Dad, she whispered. It was a broken sound. Turn it over, I commanded. She reached out with a trembling hand and turned the stack over. The last page was not a photo. It was a legal document. State of Ohio versus Mark and Sarah Harrison. Arrest warrant. Charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, grand larceny, wire fraud. I called the district attorney, I said, stepping back. He agreed that the evidence was compelling. And, I added, looking at the kitchen door, he's in the kitchen. The kitchen door swung open. Detective Vance stepped out, his badge catching the light from the chandelier. The 2 uniformed officers moved in with practiced efficiency, flanking the table. Sarah Harrison, Mark Harrison, Vance said, his voice flat and professional. You are under arrest. The reaction was pandemonium. Mark panicked. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of a trapped animal. He bolted. He shoved his own mother aside, sending Linda sprawling into the china cabinet. He scrambled toward the front door. Grab him, Vance shouted. The younger officer was faster. He tackled Mark in the hallway. They hit the floor hard, a tangle of limbs and shouting. Get off me. Mark screamed, his voice cracking like a child's. It wasn't me. It was her idea. She wanted the money. She hates him. I stood still, watching the man my daughter married try to sell her out to save his own skin. Linda and Gary began to scream. We didn't know, Linda shrieked, clutching her designer purse. We thought it was a gift. We're innocent. You accepted stolen money. I roared. The sound silenced the room. You flew first class on a stolen credit card. You drank champagne paid for by your grandson's trust fund. You were accomplices. They shrank back from me. They had never seen the Iron Judge. They had only seen Thomas the Pushover. Now, they were facing the man who had sent hardened criminals to death row. Get them out of my house, I said to the officers. They cuffed Mark and dragged him out, still screaming about his innocence. Sarah hadn't moved. She sat in the chair, staring at the warrant. The officers approached her gently. "Ma'am," the officer said, "stand up, please." She stood up slowly. Her legs gave way. She slumped against the table. The officer caught her. She looked at me. Her face was streaked with tears, her makeup running. The golden tan looked gray in the harsh light. "Dad, please," she sobbed. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She reached out to me. Her hands were shaking. "Don't let them take me. Think of Ethan. Please, Dad." My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct of fatherhood screamed at me to intervene, to write the check, to make it go away, to hug my little girl and tell her it would be all right. But then I looked at the guardianship papers on the table. The papers that would have stripped me of my humanity. The papers that would have left me to die alone in a strange room. I saw my little girl, but I also saw the woman who signed those papers. I stepped closer, but I didn't take her hand. "You made your choice, Sarah," I said. My voice was broken, filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like drowning. "You chose the lie. You chose the theft. You chose to bury me. I love you," she wailed. "I know," I said, "and I love you. That is why I had to stop you." The officer clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists. The sound was final. "Take her," I said. I turned my back. I heard her sobbing as they led her out into the rain. I heard the heavy oak door close. I stood alone in the silence. The dining room table was a mess of evidence and cold food. The gavel had struck. The verdict was delivered. I sank into my chair and buried my face in my hands, and for the first time in 40 years the Iron Judge wept. The spring came early that year. The snow melted, revealing the green shoots of crocuses in the garden Eleanor had planted. The legal process was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and Mark's attempt to pin it all on Sarah destroyed any chance of a unified defense. Mark took a plea deal for 5 years in state prison. The investigation revealed he had been laundering money for Varga for years. He was safer inside than out. Sarah pleaded guilty to fraud and elder abuse. Because she had no priors, and because her father, the victim, spoke at the sentencing, she received 2 years. Linda and Ari were fined heavily and lost their home to pay back the stolen funds. They moved to Florida, vanishing from our lives like a bad weather system. I walked into the living room. The heavy velvet drapes were open, letting the sunlight flood the space. The dust motes were still dancing, but the echoes were gone. The floor was covered in a chaotic, sprawling network of wooden train tracks. Ethan was 4.5 now. He was on his knees, pushing a blue engine along the track. "Choo-choo!" he yelled. I smiled. The house wasn't empty. It wasn't a museum anymore. It was messy. There were juice stains on the rug. There were toys in the library. It was alive. I had been granted full legal custody. It hadn't been hard. The court tends to favor the grandfather over the incarcerated parents, especially when the grandfather is Judge Thomas Sterling. "Grandpa?" Ethan looked up. He had Eleanor's eyes. They were bright, innocent, unclouded by the betrayal that had shattered his parents. "Yes, Ethan." "When is Mommy coming home?" The question still hurt. It was a sharp pang in the center of my chest. I walked over and sat on the floor beside him. My knees cracked. I was getting old, but I didn't mind. "Mommy made mistakes," I said gently, smoothing his hair. "She broke some rules, and when we break rules, we have to go to a timeout. A long one." "Is she sorry?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "She is very sorry. I visited her once a month. We spoke through the glass. She looked older, tired. The tan was gone, but she looked real. The lies were gone. We were slowly, painfully building a relationship based on truth." "Do you love her?" Ethan asked, pushing the train again. "I love her," I said. "I love her more than anything." "Then why isn't she here?" "Because," I said, picking up a wooden caboose. "Sometimes loving someone means stopping them from hurting themselves, and stopping them from hurting us." I hugged him. He smelled of milk and grass. He was solid and warm. "Come on," I said, standing up and offering him my hand. "Let's go to the kitchen. I think I have some of those blue cookies." "Yay!" he shouted, scrambling up. He ran down the hall, his footsteps thumping against the wood. The sound filled the house. I looked back at the library one last time. The desk was clean. The gavel was put away in a drawer. I didn't need it anymore. I wasn't the judge here, I was just Grandpa. And for the first time in a long time, there was peace. Call to action. Thanks for walking this journey with us all the hay. With Thomas and Sarah in mind. Was this ending how it should have happened? Or was the justice too harsh? Let us know in the comments. The State Correctional Institution for Women was 3 hours away, located in a flat, desolate stretch of farmland, where the wind whipped across the cornfields with unchecked aggression. I drove Mark's route, not literally but metaphorically. I saw the world he must have seen, gray, unyielding, a landscape of consequences. Entering the facility felt like entering a different dimension. It wasn't like my courtroom. My courtroom was wood and history and decorum. This was concrete, fluorescent tin, and the smell of industrial bleach masking the scent of unwashed bodies. I went through security. I took off my belt. I took off my watch, the Patek Philippe Eleanor had given me. I placed my keys in a plastic bin. Name? The guard asked, not looking up.
Mr. Thomas Sterling.
Inmate? Sarah Harrison. Booth 4. I walked down the long corridor. My footsteps echoed. But here, I wasn't the authority. I was just another visitor, another casualty of a crime. I sat in the plastic chair. It was bolted to the floor. The glass partition was thick, scarred by scratches from diamond rings and desperate fingernails. She was brought in 5 minutes later. I almost didn't recognize her. The prison jumpsuit was a dull, lifeless orange. Her hair, usually dyed and styled, was showing dark roots. It was pulled back in a severe ponytail. She wore no makeup. The mask was gone. She sat down. She didn't pick up the phone immediately. She just looked at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, sunken. She looked 10 years older than 32. She picked up the receiver. I did the same. The plastic felt greasy against my ear. "Dad," she said. Her voice was tinny, distorted by the electronics. "Sarah, I didn't think you'd come," she whispered. She looked down at her hands. Her fingernails were bitten to the quick. "I will always come," I said. "You are my daughter." "I'm a felon," she corrected. "I'm a thief." "You are those things too," I agreed. The judge in me could not lie. But biology is stubborn. "How is he?" she asked, her voice cracking. "How is Ethan?" "He asks for you," I said. "He thinks you are in a timeout." She let out a sob that choked off in her throat. She pressed her hand against the glass. "I hate myself," she whispered. "Every morning I wake up in this cage, and I hate myself. Not because I got caught, but because I almost did it. I almost put you in that home." "Yes," I said. "You did. Why didn't you stop me sooner?" she asked. You knew for days." "I needed to know who you were," I said. I leaned forward, my forehead almost touching the glass. "I needed to know if my daughter was still in there, or if she was gone. I gave you every chance to confess, Sarah. At dinner, in the hallway, even at the end. I was so scared of Mark," she said. "He said Varga would kill us." "Fear is a reason," I said softly. "It is not an excuse. We do not destroy the people who love us because we are afraid of the people who use us." She nodded, tears streaming down her face unchecked. "Do you remember the day you learned to ride a bike?" I asked suddenly. She blinked, confused by the shift. "What? You fell," I said. "You scraped your knees raw? You were bleeding. You screamed for me to carry you." "I remember," she sniffled. "I didn't carry you," I said. "I cleaned the wound. I put a bandage on it. And then I made you get back on the bike." I watched her through the glass. "This is the bandage, Sarah." I gestured to the prison walls. "It hurts. It stings. But I am cleaning the wound. Mark was the infection. This place, this is the cure." "Will you keep him?" she asked. "Ethan, will you keep him safe from becoming us?" "I will raise him," I said. "I will teach him the value of $1. I will teach him that truth is the only currency that matters. And I will teach him that his mother loved him enough to accept her punishment." She looked at me, and for the first time since she was a teenager, I saw clarity in her eyes. The greed was gone. The entitlement was burned away by the shame. "I'll be better," she vowed. "When I get out, I'll work. I'll pay you back. Every cent. I don't need the money, I said. I need my daughter. Time's up, the guard barked. We stood up. Goodbye, Dad, she said. I placed my hand on the glass, matching it to hers. Her hand was small. It was still the hand of the girl I used to hold crossing the street. Goodbye, Sarah, I said. See you next month. I walked out into the cold air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the prison yard. I got into my car. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I felt lighter. The anger that had fueled me, the Iron Judge anger, was dissipating. It was replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. I checked my phone. A text from the babysitter. A picture of Ethan eating a cookie, his face covered in blue icing. I started the engine. The engine purred, a sound of precision and reliability. I wasn't going back to an empty house. I was going home. I put the car in gear and drove away from the prison, leaving the past in the rearview mirror, driving toward the only future that mattered.